Okay. Hopefully you can see what I'm sharing here, the slide.
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of do a couple of things. One is speak a little bit about the tenant controller CRD and activities related to that, but also just kind of just give a review of the different threads of activity that are happening in the working group. So actually, let's start with that first. So here are some of the task threads that are kind of relatively more active than others, and this will help us to kind of review what's going on. So the firstly, so now we are kicking off an effort to have a V2 version of the tenant controller CRD and related Model B features. So if some of you have been watching our previous work, we've kind of characterized different architectural models for multi-tenancy. And, so there's models A, B, C, and D. And Model B is sort of everything around this tenant controller CRD and associated CRDs and so on. And so that's what we did the POC for earlier. So we had a first pass at it. Now, so sort of the next main task there is sort of to have an updated version or a V2 version of that and related featurettes. So that's one bucket of threads, one bucket of tasks. The second bucket of tasks is to complete our security reference profiles and initially documentation, and possibly after that some audit checking utilities as well. So there's been some work here. Tasha has done some work for baseline cluster security, and I've started some initial work around multi-tenant security profiles, but we need to build on that. So that's another set of tasks. The next set of tasks is related to the Model C proposal from Alibaba. So the next thing that has to happen there is that we would look forward to having them bring that work into open source. Currently, it is not open source. They have given us some initial presentations. We have confirmed that they do intend to bring it to open source, and we should look forward to hearing more from them in the coming weeks. And as it moves to open source, we will then be able to, within the working group, create some planning activity around that proposal. Okay, so on that one right now, we want to wait and see, wait and have the Alibaba folks bring it to the working group. Then there is various small, I wouldn't call it small, but various sort of different small threads of activity that we want to continue supporting. And we have to see whether they are sort of individual activities by themselves, or do they tie into our core architectures around models B and C. So for example, the coredump feature, which we'll hear more of today, tenant-aware coredump feature, is that something, does it tie into our overall architecture, or is it just a task by itself, or does it apply to all the models? So we want to encourage that. Similarly, we want to encourage community discussion on many of the kind of early new ideas, and as well as work that is related to multi-tenancy but happening in other SIGs and working groups. So there's been some speculative discussion about hierarchical namespaces. The folks from Red Hat have done some work around operator groups, which I suppose they are pursuing in other SIGs and working groups, but they are sort of related to what we're doing here as well. So at the moment, we don't have actual coding and design tasks active in this working group on that, but certainly we can have discussion about this and see how we can plug into those working groups, or just provide assistance. And of course, we want to continue to receive new use cases and requirements. So we do have some documentation around use cases which we want to continue building on. Okay, so these are all sort of various miscellaneous community threads that we want to keep encouraging in addition to our main threads. And finally, we want to continue developing and more formalizing our working group process and our project tracking model. So we have a project board, we have a bunch of documents. Some of them are out of date, some of them are not quite out of date. We need to clean up our repos. So we need to do some work around cleaning up our working group model. So these are sort of very high level summary of things that are happening in the working group. Obviously, there's next level of detail within each of these categories. I may have missed out some. Any questions, comments on these?
So what is cluster security reference profile documentation mean?
So one of the things we said earlier was that we would also provide a set of recommendations on what kind of cluster level configurations we would recommend for somebody wanting to run multi-tenancy on top of, whether it is models B or C. And so we started some initial documentation on those, which are in the repo, but we want to build on those further. Whether we make those reference profiles actually auditable and have some audit checking, that is still an open area for the group to decide. But anyway, that's what it is, and we have some initial documentation which we want to build on.
So that's on the links, reference links, right, in the GitHub?
Right. There's a mix of documents on the GitHub. We probably need to organize it a little bit better, but yes, the reference profile documentation is also part of the links.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, but I think we need access to see that. I don't have access, it seems. Yeah.
This is a public profile, so everyone has access to see this.
I think the access requires membership to the group, right?
No, you only have to have membership to be a member of the team, but you can see everything that's on there. It's completely open source. And you can also submit pull requests and do all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Any more questions or comments on the overall?
I have a couple of quick questions. I think the first question your next slide is going to answer, which was, are you going to go into details of what the V2 version of the tenant control is going to try to tackle on? The second question is introducing new use cases. What is the process for that? Specifically, right, I'm thinking about areas that I haven't heard any discussion, and maybe it's because you're not interested or nobody's proposed. But some of the multi-tenancy around some of the networking needs or networking separation or classes of service and so forth. And also, I would be interested in understanding if you guys have any discussion in terms of how would things like the topology manager or CPU manager be impacted by multi-tenancy. So in general, that question will be, how do I introduce new use cases? Is there a way of traditionally doing that? Just send you an email, or is there a...
So far what we've done is usually any idea or any proposal, it start off as a small write-up. It could be a one-page write-up. It could be a small 2-3 slides. And you could bring it to one of our working groups, one of the weekly meetings to just discuss it. Okay. Sometimes it requires minimal discussion, and it can be purely handled in the Slack or in the email. Tasha, I think we probably need to sort of group all the use cases in one place. Probably that's something we need to further build on.
Yeah, I have. So if you look at the project plan for this group, we have a list of use cases that people have submitted use cases to, and we also had people submit personas. So I will link to that doc again, and it's also in the links file, but it's just the project plan. The other thing that we really kind of need to keep an eye on in this working group is that we have a lot of presentations and proposals, but we don't have a lot of movement forward after that. So what we're trying to keep an eye on is actually making progress on the building blocks that we have today. So right now what that is security profiles for both a single tenant cluster and a multi-tenant cluster, and that's this Tenancy CRD. So what I would really encourage everybody to do is to look at what we're working on right now and see how we can make progress and make that better. And as we have new ideas, we should really be curating a backlog of things to pick up as we finish and make more progress on what we already have in flight.
Okay, and so what's going to derive the priority of that work or the flow of the ideas? You think just it's moving, taking a step forward in what you're doing, or is there any notion of how you decide what is the next set of functionality you need to work on?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you were on the meetings that we had in the past few months, but I presented a project plan for this group, and it's rank ordered in
Okay.
what we're going to do now, what we're going to do next, and what we're going to do in the future. I've also created a curated backlog on the project tracker in the multi-tenancy.
Okay. Just send me the link. I won't take any more time then. Go. If you send me the link, I'll read through them. Thank you.
I posted the links in the chat, so just click on the projects board to see the project board in that repo.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Just very briefly, a little bit more about tenant controller V2 tasks. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is we want to refactor and possibly rewrite the current POC. Let's call that the V1 of the tenant controller. So there's some details there. That was written using Go modules, and but not using the KubeBuilder based infrastructure. So as we try to integrate things like the resource quota management and have an updated design of that, we will need support for admission webhooks, which are handled better if it was done using KubeBuilder. So what we're doing is a small set of people that are more active and have the cycles to actually do some coding will be spending more time on the actual coding changes here. So if you're interested, feel free to contact Tasha and me. But right now, Faye from Alibaba and Kural and a few others who volunteered to spend some time on the code are going to start looking at this. So, but of course, if you feel like you have cycles and are interested in contributing to the code, feel free to reach out. We want to kind of have the V2 of this handled initially by a small group to get the critical mass going, and then obviously everyone in the working group will be able to review and provide additional comments. But of course, if you do have cycles to contribute to the controller development for the V2 version, feel free to reach out to Tasha and me, and then we'll connect with the appropriate folks. So that's kind of the first thing here, that we have to refactor and rewrite that. Also, what we did as the architecture for the different CRDs, that was just a first version. We had put certain things on the back burner. For example, having a tenant template CRD in addition to a namespace template. So I'm actually not going over all the details of the tenant controller here because I'm assuming many of you are familiar. But if you do want me to go back into tenant controller V1 in today's call, then after the presentation from Fujitsu, we can go back to the V1 tenant controller if you want to discuss some more details. Today's call, I was just planning to give a summary of tasks that we are kicking off for V2.
I'd be interested in hearing more about the actual schema of the V2 creds.
Yes. So that the V2 schemas is actually a task which we are just starting to work on right now. We don't have an updated version to report just yet.
Okay.
It'll be analogous to the V1, but there has to be some updated architecture. For example, the bullet 2 I'm mentioning here, we need to look at whether we want to have an additional tenant template in addition to a namespace template and tenant CRD. We had kind of deferred on the discussion of cluster scope resources. So in the model that we had earlier, we only had namespace scope resources in tenants because tenants were basically built out of namespaces and namespace templates, which could not contain cluster scope resources. So we want to go back to whether it's possible to add cluster scope resources into model B, or whether that stays out of model B and is only available in model C. That's an area which we have to do some design work. And obviously what we will do here is we'll do some offline design, and then what we will do is bring it to the team here so that we can all review and stay on top of the design as we go over the next few weeks.
So what is the rationale for pursuing cluster scope resources for the tenants in an option B?
Yeah, so the thought was that it appears that in certain enterprises, people feel like tenants ought to be able to provision certain cluster scope resources. For example, you may want each tenant to define their own CRDs. CRDs today are cluster scope resources. So if you do not allow tenants to define cluster scope resources, that means you do not allow tenants to define their own CRDs, which means CRDs have to be out of band. A tenant has to make sure that the cluster has the CRDs they need, and there has to be a kind of an offline process between the tenant and the cluster to make sure the cluster has the CRDs needed by the tenant. But it would be more self-service model if tenants could dynamically create their own CRDs. So
Yeah,
that's an example.
I got it. I didn't realize the CRDs were cluster scope. That makes sense. The need for this then.
I've also wondered if we should recommend to have a namespaced scope CRD object. It seems to be kind of a common need.
Yes, so this is an open area. We should think about different options here. But again, if we are going to make a proposal to the other teams, it would be received well if we add some meat to it, right? If we just say, hey, can somebody think of a cluster scope, namespace scope CRD? The typical response from the other six is, yeah, sounds good. Can you develop a prototype? Then we can talk about it, right? So what happens usually with these is that the other six, if we propose something to the other six, we have to develop it quite a bit before we take it to the other six. Otherwise, it will just kind of fall by the wayside. But yeah, your idea is absolutely valid. It is worthwhile thinking of a namespace scope CRD option. But if you can meet around it, that'll be good.
The operator framework folks are recommending frequently to deploy the operators namespaced scoped. So they may have some interest in that particular type of object too. So we might reach out to them.
Absolutely, and I think some of the proposals from Red Hat about operator groups kind of fit into that. I know we have some attendance from Red Hat, but I would welcome more input from Red Hat on how they see that and whether they could contribute to that or any other areas here. Anybody from Red Hat on the call want to chime in?
Yeah, a couple of us are on the call. We also think that having like a namespaced version of a CRD would be really cool. I think, as you alluded to, though, there's so much work involved across so many other SIGs to make that happen that I'm not sure that this is the place for that. I think that that's more of like an API machinery responsibility, and it's unfortunately not super straightforward because now the set of APIs that you see is different based on the namespace that you're requesting. So it's not a minor change to add that feature.
Yeah.
But you're right, it would make talking about this stuff significantly simpler.
Yeah, I just
even if we don't actually have namespaced CRDs, but if we could, we should speculate about ways we can just limit the scope of current cluster scoped CRDs. Like, for example, this is just a thought off the top of my head. I haven't given it full detailed analysis, but let's say that we have a CRD creation request, right? Almost like a certificate signing request, where a tenant could actually propose a CRD template and some level of controller which is dynamically accepted by the cluster. I know this is very, very speculative at this point, but something like that, where tenants could propose, and then those CRDs could be created automatically scoped to that tenant's namespaces.
I want to say the operator framework stuff has something like that in their catalog operator, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, that's correct. If you've published an operator that defines CRDs that it uses, there is an optional step of like having that written out as essentially a proposed object to be approved by someone with enough permission to install it. I think the bigger issue is that all of the features being built around CRDs right now in Kubernetes are very, very much scoped to the cluster. So for example, 115, we have cluster, conversion webhooks, but you can only register one endpoint for all namespaces, unlike admission webhooks. So if you are building something that's using CRDs and you want it to be tenant scoped, well, now all of your tenants have to share both the CRD version and the conversion webhooks. So there's no way to have, for example, two tenants on different versions of some CRD controller because they need to be synced because the requests all go to the same place.
Yeah.
So bottom line here is that this is an open area. In the Model B work, at the moment, we do not have any cluster scope resources, right? And maybe that's adequate for certain deployment cases, but we should continue to think about cluster scope resources for Model B. But then this is where Model C comes into play. With Model C, you can actually have cluster scope resources per tenant. And that's where the primary value of the Model C comes in. But as I said earlier, Model C is still not yet open source. So we look forward to having Alibaba bring more details from that. And we may conclude that Model B will only have namespace scope resources. And if you really want cluster scope resources per tenant, then you really have to have Model C, which we need to develop further. So anyway, we are not here to solve the problem. We are just saying that these are the tasks that need attention. And then the resource quota management. So we had Kural present sort of some initial thoughts there, but we gave him some feedback about wanting to treat resource quotas at the tenant level and kind of decouple them from the namespace level quotas. And also, take some ideas from how OpenShift and Rancher do their quota management for products and projects and cluster resource quotas. So we need to update that and then integrate that quota management into the controller for Model B.
Is there a write-up for how OpenShift or Rancher does quota management?
Well, their own respective, you go to the OpenShift and Rancher web pages and they explain what they do with.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, like we are deriving things from there. So I was thinking maybe somebody did some research and said, these are the things we should include from there.
If you look at, there's an object called cluster resource quota in OpenShift that has some more details. In Rancher, there is a project resource quota, which is, it's a resource quota across a set of namespaces. So those are the concepts that are trying to do similar things, and we want to bring it into this work here. Okay. And possibly extend it. Yeah. So, and that would then possibly make use of an admission webhook, and which is why, going back to the first point, that we may want to rewrite the current POC using KubeBuilder and integrate the resource quota management webhook. So that's all kind of related set of tasks. There were some other miscellaneous tasks which were still open in terms of the design and architecture about namespace naming. This whole point about namespaces have to be uniquely named in a cluster. And, if we wanted to have the possibility that tenants wouldn't need to coordinate with each other, they could pick their own namespace names. And, we would concatenate the tenant name in front of the namespace name, but that there was some that needed a little bit more discussion. So these are all design topics that we'll be going over in the next few weeks. The other one was, fully having a complete POC with a complete set of RBAC and pod security reference policies to implement this controller, so that we make sure we really, have a fully working solution. And some of that may tie into the baseline cluster security profile work as well. But here we are really talking about the security profile, the features that go into the namespace templates, right? So we want to have a fully defined set of policies to go with this controller. And then the last thing is we want to think about other aspects, including add-on services, right? So integrating this tenancy model with monitoring and logging, specifically using Prometheus. So having a design and a prototype implementation of a multi-tenant Prometheus using the same CRD as model B, V2, and sort of having that be the complete solution.
So does that include the logging too with something like FluentD, or only Prometheus?
Yes, logging as well. So again, there is a whole set of additional services here. I'm not even describing the whole things here.
Yeah.
What we really, this is more like a subsequent. Once we close on the exact, it can be partially in parallel, but we want to definitely close on the V2 controller spec. Have it exactly be clear about the namespace ownership and namespace modeling and so on, whether it has cluster scope resources or not. And then somewhat in parallel with that, we would want to kick off activities that anybody, and this is again an open area for somebody to come in and raise their hand, and if they want to pick up any of these areas, to say, okay, let's look at what can be done with current existing Prometheus, that can the RBAC model of current Prometheus fit into this tenancy model? Will some new functionality be needed? If not, we at least produce a reference POC. And if we find some gaps are there, then we'll have to go back and talk to the Prometheus guys or whatever. But right now, the initial task would be just develop a reference implementation and a POC in which we have Prometheus as well as EFK working in the same multi-tenant setup as the tenant controller V2.
But your model here is similar to model B, right? It's a single stood up LMA stack that is multi-tenant and serves as opposed to other approaches, which would be like your model C, where you're basically standing an individual stack per tenant. This slide, everything in this slide is about model B. Yeah.
Where do you make those efforts? Like, I just looked at the multi-tenancy issues and I can't find them in there. Are they somewhere listed, or?
So they're sort of, we haven't listed every tasks because there's these baseline tasks up front which need to happen even before those, right? So Tasha and I will continue to clean up the project board and kind of the task backlog. So it has been listed, but we need to do more in terms of a formal backlog. Are you interested in sort of picking up these tasks right away in parallel?
Yeah, we have some of these issues. We're doing multi-tenancy for over a year now, and I just was curious to see if there's any issue that I can follow or that we maybe even can contribute to. Depends a bit on what exactly it is. So I was looking into the Kubernetes 6 / multi-tenancy issues list, and I couldn't find those things here. So I was wondering where you track them. Yeah,
so we've got, it's kind of a mix right now. We haven't been formally using the issues list, and neither have people been submitting issues. So that information is spread between some of the docs page under the links, as well as the project board that Tasha mentioned. But maybe we'll, as I said earlier, we'll have a little bit cleanup of our issue management process, and whether we encourage everybody to submit issues or whether we encourage submit entries to the project board. I think, Tasha, should we maybe come back to the working group next time and kind of have a more clearly defined process for submitting issues and sort of updating the project board and so on?
Yes, please, because I'm struggling to know the difference between Model B and Model C at this point. That's just the basic stuff that all these other things are relying on.
Well,
I
that's
really
an entirely
recommend you
separate thing.
review. I really recommend you review the KubeCon presentation from the working group. There were slides that really neatly explained the differences between models A to C.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if you want a technical understanding of these different models, take a look at the working group deep dive, and that's separate from the issue tracking and the backlog tracking and the project board. So, but for things like a full backlog of items, either immediate items or slightly longer term items, yes, you are welcome to open issues, although we haven't been following a consistent process of opening issues in this working group yet. So maybe, Tasha, let's take an action item to have an update to the team next time on, what would be the entire
Sure.
kind of
So what I would say is for new members, we have so all of the docs are on the GitHub location. So it's just github.com/kubernetes-sig/multi-tenancy. So if you click the docs and then you click the links page, it has the links to all of the documents that Sanjeev is referring to. We also have a YouTube channel that has all of the multi-tenancy videos that you can watch. It includes the KubeCon presentations. So for people who don't know what we're talking about when we refer to the different models of multi-tenancy, there are very good reviews there, and everything's on YouTube and posted. So what I would say is just take a look at the deep dive or if you're really brand new, take a look at the intro from KubeCon EU, which was just a few weeks ago, where Sanjeev and I went over what the working group has been working on. Take a look at the project plan. And it's really very simple. What is in the project plan is in the backlog on the GitHub docs, in the GitHub project tracker that I linked to here. And so when you see things, if you want to get involved in the Tenancy CRD, just go to that and drop an issue. And then you could assign the issue to yourself, or I can assign the issue to you. And this is just a way for us to be very transparent about who's working on what. And in that way, we really want to empower people to jump in on this code base and start tackling pieces. And so it's very open in that way. If you have questions, we are in the multi-tenancy Slack channel for Kubernetes, and the mailing list is a great place to ask questions as well. But we are trying to centralize discussions of code to the GitHub repo, just so we have a good sort of tracking of the conversations happening there.
Okay, one small question related to the monitoring and logging part. When we are saying phase 1 of Tenancy for add-on services monitoring logging, are we thinking about how in a multi-tenancy world Prometheus is going to emit metrics which are only visible to one tenant, metrics of one tenant being visible only for that, only to that tenant users?
That's right.
Okay, yeah. And similarly logging, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah,
got it.
I'd like to pause this part of the conversation for now, because we do have Yushiro on, and he's going to present on his coredump feature, and we only have 20 minutes left. So if there are any follow-on questions, just put them in the response to the agenda in the Google group, or ask on the multi-tenancy Slack channel, and we can answer them over there.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, let me hand over to Yoshi for his update.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev and Tasha. Okay, now so we are talking about the any update for our coredump feature. So I'm so sorry, I was okay. I'm so sorry for late. I was late for joining today. So the Bao will share the screen, but Bao, maybe it will arrive. Okay.
Thank you. Can you?
Well, your screen is a little blinking.
So maybe my network is not good. Yushiro, can you share?
Sure. Okay, just a moment. I will share the screen. So just a moment. Sorry. This is my video. Just a moment. About so today's agenda.
Today we will
which document I will share?
Agenda.
Okay. Yeah, can you see?
Yeah, I can see. Today we will show 3 items. First, report of current status of coredump feature. We launched coredump feature version 1 2 weeks ago, and now in version 1, coredump feature support Docker runtime and NFS as storage backend. In future version, we will support CRI-O as container runtime and Ceph or Gluster as storage backends. Yeah, this is current status. Next, we will demo coredump feature. So, could you explain this? Furukawa will share movie.
Okay, I can explain this.
Yushiro, can you share video?
Okay, just a moment. Just a moment, please. All right. Okay. One can you see this my screen?
Yeah, I can see.
Yep.
Yeah, we have all these files. The coredump function file contains all the objects we need to implement the coredump function. The admin.kubecom stands for the administrator authority, and another kubecom stands for a common user authority. And the simple pod file will be used later to show how a coredump file be downloaded. Let's begin. Firstly, let's create some allies. Then we use the coredump function yum file to let the coredump function boot. Wait the pod start. Okay. Now the coredump function is ready. Assume a common user wants to run a pod and get the coredump from that pod. Use that simple pod yum file. Of course, by default, a common user has no authority to create a pod. We should give him the authority so he can create that pod. Row and row binding. Now let's create it. The pod is start. Now the pod is ready. Let's trigger some job crash inside it. We start a sleep and kill it. Now we have the job crashed. So it's time to download the core files. Before, if a user want to download any coredump files, firstly he must create an object called coredump endpoint. And the coredump endpoint has the same name of the pod which he want to download the core files from. So we see the coredump endpoint share the same name and the namespace with that pod. Of course, by default, the user has no authority. The administrator must give him the corresponding authority. And we also gives him the sub-resource called dump. Later we will access this sub-resource to get the coredump file. Forget the row binding. And the coredump endpoint was created. Now we can download the core files. We access the sub-resource called dump to download these core files, and we must give Kubernetes the name of the container. Now we have a compressed file. That's the dump file and the information inside the proc. So that's how it works.
Thank
So
you.
any questions?
So just creating the coredump endpoint resulted in the coredump controller populating that link, right? That gives you the download link?
Yes, it's a link.
And I think you mentioned something about a dump sub-resource. Is that something that a CRD supports? Like you can create sub-resources on the fly?
I didn't get you very well. Can you
So maybe,
say that again?
like I didn't understand. When you said a dump sub-resource, what do you mean?
I mean, we have an object called coredump endpoints, and we register another RESTful API called dump. It's a kind of sub-resource.
Can you show the definition of that dump?
Definition?
So that works kind of like the pod logs sub-resource.
Correct. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is this the same thing? Like, is this something similar? And does a CRD allow us to define sub-resources like that?
No, how it works, it's similar to the log, pod logger
Okay.
in Kubernetes.
So it's an aggregated API service?
What?
Is it, so you can't define sub-resources with CRDs. Is it a completely separate CRD resource, or is it like a sub-resource in an aggregated API server, where it's not defined by a CRD?
Yeah, it's not defined by CRD. It's just it's a aggregation API.
Okay, thanks.
Got it. Okay.
So have you guys given some thought on, since we are kind of discussing this in the context of multi-tenancy, is there, do you want to first sort of have this be a, core dump solution independent of multi-tenancy, and then as an additional phase, make it tenant aware, depending on the Tenancy CRDs that we come up with? How do you expect to tie it in with multi-tenancy? Because it is useful on its own with or without multi-tenancy.
So you mean when job crashes, how would a user know that some job crashed in the pod?
No, not just that, but if you want a tenant aware core dump function, you should be able to have things like, okay, here's your common remote core dump location, but cores from tenant A are not accessible to tenant B. Core dumps of tenant A are not accessible. Is that just a question of RBAC done appropriately, or like, can you comment on making this solution tenancy aware? Because we're discussing this solution in the context of multi-tenancy working group, right? If you want to have this be a solution independent of tenancy, then it can be developed outside of the multi-tenancy working group. But if it is developed inside of the multi-tenancy working group, you also want to have an architecture for how this works in a multi-tenant cluster, so that tenants cannot access each other's core dumps.
Okay, so you mean we need some other mechanism to, besides RBAC, like to make it better?
No, it could be that RBAC is sufficient. I just would like to see it clearly spelled out, like essentially an architecture diagram which shows n number of tenants sharing a cluster, each of them having their own core dump, and either a shared remote core dump server or dedicated core dump servers. And is just a question of setting up RBAC correctly, or something more than that, right?
Yeah, if the core dump is fetched through a sub-resource, then it should, RBAC should apply to it, and it shouldn't be much different than any other RBAC managed resource at the namespace level. But I think it's all okay.
Yeah, so that's probably the case, but I just wanted to be spelled out, and maybe a kind of an architecture diagram that makes it a little bit more explicit.
Yeah.
And then if that is the case, then, what would be the appropriate, like, what should the multi-tenancy group do with it as opposed to, another working group? So, I mean, it's firstly, obviously it's a useful feature, so that's great. I'm just trying to place it in the context of the multi-tenancy architecture, and whether what can be done in this working group versus versus another working group?
Well, one thing I could think of is maybe quota, because the core dumps aren't necessarily small, and so you might not want one tenant blowing out the capacity for everybody else.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think the point for the folks from Fujitsu is if you could frame the solution in the context of a multi-tenant cluster, I think that would sort of complete the whole picture.
We think we are not sure if this feature is appropriate for this multi-tenancy topic. So we would like to know, is this feature appropriate for multi-tenancy group or not, by discussing with you, with group members. So this is the reason we show this feature in this meeting.
Have you discussed with any other working groups or SIGs?
We haven't discussed it with any other working group or SIG. But in the past, we post discussion about this feature in Kubernetes, but there is no action. There is no good response. There is no response from community. So we try to look at appropriate place to discuss.
So my thought here is that, and of course we are kind of out of time here, but I'll just quickly mention it, that this feature is useful with or without multi-tenancy, right? If you would like to pursue it as a multi-tenant specific feature, then you may want to explicitly document through a topology diagram, perhaps a multi-tenant cluster in which tenant aware core dump facilities are provided. Does that require any new work beyond the fact that RBAC already takes care of it? And then we can decide whether this piece of work can be continued within this working group or whether it's more appropriate within another working group.
I understand. And okay, if there is any sample to describe any sample of architecture diagram or not, or so, please share us, and I will check it and propose a diagram of our feature. So,
okay, yeah, let's discuss in the Slack.
Thank you. Okay. At next, in the future, we will propose architecture diagram.
And tying it to multi-tenancy or not tying it to multi-tenancy, right? That kind of.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think this was a really good demo, and to kind of echo Sanjeev's point, just having sort of a topology diagram explaining how you would use this in a multi-tenant cluster would be awesome. And since this is a tool that we think would be useful for people even if they're not running in a multi-tenant situation, it's probably something that we should, probably a tool that we should suggest gets talked about in maybe sig-auth or something. I don't know. Which group do you think would be best, Sanjeev?
Good question.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's try to elevate the attention in some of the other groups as well. But I definitely think that this is a cool tool that a lot of people might get some value out of.
Okay. Okay. I see.
Okay. Which side is over?
Yeah. So, okay, thank you for taking the time. Okay, I will stop the sharing. Just a moment.